Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since of course it was a toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows in the chamber to monitor these 5 men. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep in, no bedding, running water, toilet, and enough dried food to last them all over a month. The test subjects varied, but were all political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely of course, that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about the increasingly traumatic incidents of their past. And the general tone of their conversations took a darker aspect after the 4th day. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternatively whispering into the microphones. In one way, mirrored the porthole. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them even. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. And after 9 days, the first of them started to scream. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn out his own vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captors reacted to it. Or rather, how they didn't react to it. They continued whispering into the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and then pasted them calmly over the glass book. The screaming promptly stopped, and so did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure that they were working, since they thought it was impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people in a room. The oxygen consumption in the room indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something that they said that they would never do to get a reaction from the captives. They used an intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Please step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase and a calm response. "We no longer want to be free." Debate broke out amongst the researchers as the military forces funding the research also started to contemplate. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided that they would actually open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began to beg, as if pleading if their life and their loved ones were on the line. They just wanted the gas turned back on. The chamber was open, and the soldiers were sent to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state they were in alive. The food rations past day 5 had not even been touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chests shoved into the drain in the center chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was blood was never actually determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their own bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds inflicted indicated that most, if not all of them, were nearly self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been torn off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of these subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that they were digesting their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of these days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still, many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded for the gas to be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers actually died from having his throat torn out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count the ones that committed suicide following this incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living test subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one of the doctors. When his heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he bled out, to the point where there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for over 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and repeating the word, "More!" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously began begging and begging for the gas to be returned to them so they could be. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back in his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to all sedatives. He fought fiercely against his restraints when the knockout gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, and even through the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding on that wrist as well. It took only a little more of the knockout gas than normal to put him under. And the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. And the autopsy of this test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had triple the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle not to be subdued. Most of them were from the force of his own muscles that he had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords were destroyed. He was unable to beg or object to the surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the knockout gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested reluctantly that they try the surgery without it, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for this patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming that this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had pen and paper fetched so that the patient could write his message. It was a simple message. "Keep cutting!" The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without the knockout gas as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the intending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic had cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to have the gas again. Only one response was given. "I must remain awake!" All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of the project, considered euthanizing these surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but of course they were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going to have the gas again. It was obvious at this point that all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might, first left, first right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head high off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for the EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brain waves in surprise. They were normal for most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw that his eyes slipped shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that deep sleep, then flatlined for a last time, as his heart stopped with it. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming again. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as the one who had died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as the 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains right across the wall. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed, as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I will not be locked in here with those things! Not with you!" He screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you? I have to know!" The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are madness that lurks within all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked. "So near